The History of EdTech, What Went Wrong by Audrey Watters. I highly encourage you to check out her blog, Hack Education. So in this article, Audrey talks about how educational technology was once adopted by progressive educators, and then eventually in the 80s, it became much more corporate as different tools and practices became commodified. One of the quotes that really stood out to me comes from Ian Bogost, who said, "What if the decentralized open web was a historical aberration, an accident between broadcast models, not an idea that was won and then lost?" And I think this is one of the most powerful statements that I've read in an article over the last few years. Because if you really stop and think, when it comes to media, it's always traditionally been controlled by small groups of people. Movies have always been controlled by, famous movie houses or studios, specifically in Hollywood. Radio stations were never really democratized. The news always comes from the typical studios, CNN, Fox. Newspapers always came from the same large news sites or newspapers. And so what's interesting then is that when you see YouTube, you see what's gone on with like Web 2.0 tools and how really everybody has the opportunity to publish and to share and to really share their story. And I like to think that if researchers were able to come back 100 years from now and look at what was going on in this time, what would researchers find in your classroom if you're a teacher or a student? Would they find, documentaries that you or your students created? Would they find 3D models that told, elaborate stories? Would they find like digital images and media, something in VR? Or would these researchers find spreadsheets upon spreadsheets upon spreadsheets with names and yellow columns and red columns and green columns? In essence, would they come back and find, that you were just a number at this point? Or would researchers be able to come back and find, your story and who you were? And I think that overwhelmingly what researchers would find is the story of kids that came from more affluent communities, and then students who were a part of traditionally marginalized and disenfranchised communities will continue to do so. And so for me as an educator, when I read this article, it gives me the imperative and the push to make sure that my students have access to the tools to be able to tell their story just as any other student with the same access would and should have.